2002, the Suzanne von Richthofen case gripped Brazil. In the year when the nation's football team won the Football World Cup against Germany in Japan, this football-mad country's main talking point turned from football to Suzanne von Richthofen. I say football, but those of you from North America, I am of course referring to soccer. 1983 in São Paulo. She had a German father and a Brazilian mother. Her father was an engineer named Manfred Albert von Richthofen, and her mother, Mauricia, was of Lebanese descent. Her father was the director of the State Company for Highway Development in São Paulo, and her mother was who was born in 1987. Suzanne studied at a German high school before moving on to study law at a Catholic university in São Paulo. She was described as happy but a little shy. Suzanne was known to have a very good relationship with her parents and her brother. They all lived together in a comfortable house in a gated community in the Campo Bella neighborhood of São Paulo. She was well educated, pretty, and had parents with an estimated wealth in 2002 of $5.5 million. In the summer of 1999, she started practicing Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, where she got to know Daniel Cravinhos de Paulo da Silva, who soon became her boyfriend. Suzanne's parents at first allowed her relationship with Daniel, but soon changed their opinion of him when they discovered that he used marijuana almost daily. He did not work or attend college and did not come from a particularly good neighborhood. In July 2002, her parents were on vacation, so Daniel moved in with Suzanne for a month, much to her delight. When her parents returned home, Suzanne suggested that they buy her a flat in which she could live with Daniel, but her father refused, saying that she could do whatever she liked, only if she earned money herself. Suzanne's relationship with Daniel started to put a strain on her relationship with her parents. Her parents pressured her to break off the relationship, but she refused. They then threatened to cut off her allowance. Before we proceed, I've got an exciting surprise for you. We've launched a brand new channel dedicated to intriguing content such as old historical mysteries, cold cases, and particularly chilling horror stories perfect for bedtime. Drop a comment letting us know if you're a fan of horror stories or not. You can find the link in the description below. Let's find out who will be the first to explore it. Alright, let's dive back into the video. On the night of the 31st of October, 2002, Suzanne took her brother to a cyber cafe to meet friends and play video games. Then Suzanne, along with her boyfriend Daniel and his 26-year-old brother Christian, went to her home. Earlier that evening, she had deactivated the burglar alarm and turned off the video security cameras, and drove into the garage. Her boyfriend Daniel and his brother Christian put on hoods and entered the house. She entered first, going up the stairs to her parents' bedroom, turned on the light in the hall, and verified that her father and mother were asleep. She went downstairs and sat on the couch. The brothers went upstairs to the parents' bedroom and hit her parents with iron bars. Did not die quickly, despite suffering severe brain trauma. To finish them off, Daniel ran to the bathroom and came back with 2 wet towels. They put them over their victims' faces in an attempt to drown out the sounds they were making, but this didn't work. So Daniel went to the kitchen and returned with a jug of water and attempted to drown Suzanne's parents. This managed to kill her father Manfred. But at this point her mother, Mauricia, was still alive. So they tied her head in a plastic bag until she finally suffocated. Once it was over, Suzanne came upstairs to see for herself that her parents were dead. The 3 of them then put the second stage of their plan into action by making the scene look like a break-in. They pocketed money they found and spread papers over the house, creating a mess. This part of the plan was not executed well, as they left valuables, cell phones, and a gun, all of which are things burglars would be unlikely ever to leave behind. They did, however, take the family's stash of cash, a considerable amount of money in both US dollars and euros. Then they left. Daniel and Suzanne checked into a motel to establish an alibi, and Christian went to a fast food restaurant. Just before 3 in the morning, they checked out of the motel, and Suzanne dropped her boyfriend off and picked up her little brother Andreas, then aged 15, at an internet cafe and went home, where they discovered the crime. They instantly called the police. The investigating officers, however, doubted that this was a burglary that had gone wrong and very quickly thought that it had been committed by someone known to the victims. They soon began to question the children and the employees of the Richthofen family. What made them suspicious was not only the crime scene, with the alarm system switched off and papers spread very regularly and as if by design, but also the extraordinary coolness of Suzanne, who was seen in the house swimming pool with Daniel the day after the murder and who celebrated her 19th birthday with friends just hours after her parents' burial. The investigators focused their attention on Suzanne and her boyfriend. The clue for the arrest came with Christian, who had bought a motorcycle a few days later and paid cash in $100 bills. A few days later, on November 9, 2002, he was arrested along with his brother Daniel and Suzanne. Suzanne very quickly broke down and confessed to the murder. The investigation was concluded within a week. The case generated massive media attention in Brazil due to the stark contrast between the brutal crime and the personality of Suzanne. While the brothers fitted the usual profile of the uneducated, unemployed, drug-addicted killers, this was not true for Suzanne. She was a pretty blonde girl from an upper-middle-class family of German and Lebanese descent. Well-behaved, always doing well at school, speaking 3 foreign languages and doing ballet. The contrast between her affluent upbringing and the cruelty of a crime shocked the nation. The Brazilian public questioned whether Suzanne was the evil mind behind the crime or just Daniel's tool. Many people who initially were emotionally on Suzanne's side changed their opinion when a TV interview with her was shown. Before the interview took place, the cameras had already started rolling, and she was instructed to cry out loud during the broadcast so it would create public sympathy. In the end, however, the interview was a major blow for her credibility. In July 2006, almost 4 years after the murders, Suzanne, along with Daniel and Christian, were put on trial in São Paulo for first-degree murder. On trial, Suzanne blamed Daniel for everything, while the brothers claimed that they acted upon her desire. In court, Suzanne was very cool, without emotion, while the brothers were crying most of the time. On one occasion, she even started to laugh. Suzanne claimed she did it all for love, for fear that Daniel would leave her if her parents were not killed. Her lawyer said that Suzanne had no motive at all to kill, but was forced to the crime by Daniel, whom she adored like a god. Another part of the motive may have been the parents' wealth, which Suzanne would inherit in the event of the parents' death. The prosecution said that Suzanne wanted to get her hands on the money and assets of her parents, and she wanted freedom and independence without having to work for it. On trial, her defense lawyer claimed that Suzanne was physically violated by her father, which she and her brother Andreas deny. It was also claimed that Suzanne's parents were alcoholics, but the autopsy found no alcohol in their bodies. The prosecution called Suzanne the mastermind of the crime. They demanded 50 years imprisonment for each of the 3 defendants. Suzanne was described as a personification, the evil blonde. On July 22, 2006, Suzanne was sentenced to 40 years in prison for the crime. Daniel, her boyfriend, received the same sentence, and his brother Christian was sentenced to 38 years for conspiracy. In 2009, Suzanne tried to get her sentence changed to house arrest. Her appeal was denied. She then tried again 2 years later. The same result. In 2011, her younger brother Andreas sued his sister for her half of the inheritance, including the money paid out on her parents' life insurance. He won. George Smith was born in London on January 11, 1872. His father was an insurance agent, and while his family were not rich, they were financially comfortable. George was born in Bethnal Green, London, and when he was 9, he was sent to a reformatory in Gravesend as he was caught stealing. The punishment was designed to be a short, sharp shock treatment to stop young children from offending again. But for George, Smith being locked up for 7 years from the age of 9 to 16 led to what many considered to be a harsh punishment on a boy so young. Far from serving as a deterrent, being locked up did not deter George Smith from going on to commit far more serious crime. He probably learned a lot from his fellow inmates, such as how to use false identities and how to commit fraud. In 1898, George married Caroline Beatrice Thornhill, but he used a false name, Oliver George Love. She was 18 and probably thought she was marrying a prosperous businessman who owned a bread shop. The shop, however, went bankrupt, so Caroline started working as a maid for a number of employers, stealing from them before leaving. In order to stay one step ahead of the law, they moved to Brighton and Eastbourne so Caroline could continue to work as a maid and steal from her employers. When George instructed Caroline to pawn some, she was arrested when a suspicious pawnbroker called the police. She went to prison for a year while George just disappeared. When Caroline was released from prison after serving a 12-month sentence, she by complete chance saw George, so she called the police. He was arrested, and due to Caroline's statement, he was sentenced to 2 years in prison in January 1901. They never got divorced, but Caroline then emigrated to Canada. After Caroline went to Canada, George went on a campaign of bigamy, marrying different women, always for money. He would either persuade them to hand over their money, usually saying it was for a business venture, or he would insure their lives. Once he had what he wanted, he would simply disappear, leaving victims with broken hearts and empty bank accounts. He was lucky, as in the early 20th century large numbers of young men had emigrated to countries such as Australia and Canada, which meant that by 1910 British females outnumbered men by more than 500,000. The newspapers are full of stories about women who could not find husbands. Such spinsters were perfect prey for George. He was smooth-talking, slim, with muscular physique, and always wore brightly colored bow ties. He liked to walk along seafront promenades and parks in search for lonely and vulnerable women. In the summer of 1910, he was walking in Clifton, Bristol, when he met Bessie Munday, a woman in her mid-30s. Her father, who had been a bank manager, had died, and she had inherited £2,500, which today would be about £280,000. George introduced himself as Henry Williams. He said that he worked as a picture restorer in London. They went out together for walks, and very soon after they met, they were married at a registry office in Weymouth. George, however, was unable to get his hands on her money, as it had been placed in the hand of trustees. He did manage to persuade Bessie to give him £150 in cash. When she did, he left, accusing her of infecting him with a venereal disease. 18 months later, Bessie was walking in a popular seaside resort of Weston-super-Mare, and she saw George. They spoke, and she was very happy to take back her husband after he explained that, having contracted of a venereal disease, he considered it best to leave rather than pass it on to her. He told her that he had been looking for her for a long time and would like to continue the marriage. In May 1912, a couple moved to Herne Bay in Kent, and George persuaded his wife to make a will, leaving everything to him. Afterwards, they visited an ironmonger and purchased a cast-iron bath. George then convinced his wife that she was an epileptic, and on Friday, July 12th, took her to see the doctor. Bessie had no history of fits, but agreed to be examined by the local doctor and repeat the symptoms that George had described to her. The following morning, the doctor received a pencil-written note from George. "Come at once," it read, "my wife is dead." The doctor arrived to find Bessie on her back in the bath, her face still partially submerged. George claimed this was how he found her. The doctor attributed the death to drowning, and George was awarded the full inheritance of £2,500 by an inquest jury. Despite his sudden wealth, George did not spend much on the funeral. He chose the cheapest coffin and refused to pay for a private plot, so Bessie had to be buried in a common grave. He even returned the bath to the ironmonger and obtained a refund. With a murder weapon disposed of, it seemed George had committed the perfect crime, but he had overlooked one thing. Unbeknown to him, Bessie was holding a bar of soap in her right hand when she died, and the doctor had noted that her fingers remained clamped tightly around it. Just over a year later, in November 1913, George married 25-year-old Alice Burnham, who was a nurse. They met in Southsea on their wedding day, November the 4th. He took her to a doctor who certified that she was healthy enough to take out a £500 insurance policy on her life, with George the sole beneficiary. The same pattern followed. He also persuaded her to make a will, leaving everything to him. They went to Blackpool on a belated honeymoon and found accommodation with a George's wife had caused to see a doctor, and George told the doctor that his wife was suffering from persistent headaches. On the evening of Friday, December the 12th, 3 days after they arrived in Blackpool, George was talking to Mrs. Crosley in the kitchen when they noticed small drops of water leaking through the kitchen ceiling while Alice was upstairs having a bath. George quickly went upstairs and discovered his wife dead in the bath. Once again, there were no signs of anything suspicious. Very little was spent on the funeral. The inquest jury decided that Alice had drowned after fainting, so George inherited £600. At the time of her death, they had been married just over a month. George carried on his bigamous ways, and in November 1914, he met Margaret Lofty of, in all places, the English city of Bath. This time, George used the name John Lloyd. They married on December the 18th, 1914. After they got married, they began a brief honeymoon in Highgate, North London, with George again insisting that his new wife see a local doctor on their wedding night. The first evening there, George played some music on the piano in the living room. Then he left the house, telling Milan Lady that he was going out to buy some tomatoes. On his return, strangely, he rang the bell so Milan Lady would let him in, even though he had a key. He went upstairs, where he discovered the drowned body of his wife. Again, there was no money spent on the funeral. George claimed the insurance payment, but this time there was a delay because one of her witnesses was ill. Strange deaths at seaside resorts were always reported in local newspapers in Edwardian Britain and were always read by local people, but a bride drowning on her honeymoon in a bath in London featured in national newspapers and was read about all over the Country by readers like Charles Burnham, Alice Burnham's father, and William Haynes in Blackpool, who lived near to Mrs. Crosley where Alice was murdered. The husbands involved had different names, but in each case were newly married and in each case had discovered their wide lives dead in the bath. On receiving letters from the public, the Metropolitan Police looked at the similarities with the death of Alice Smith and Margaret Lofty and decided it was probably not a coincidence, so they gave the case to a highly skilled detective named Arthur Neal. Inspector Neal was certain that Mr. Smith and Mr. Lloyd were the same person, and by piecing together their movements across the country over the previous years, he discovered the case of Bessie Munday, who died exactly the same way in 1910 in Herne Bay. In the Margaret Lofty case, Inspector Neal quickly discovered that a will had been made in which the sole beneficiary was her husband. The inspector contacted the coroner named Dr. Bates, who had examined the body, and he revealed that he had been contacted by an insurance company in Yorkshire. On speaking to the insurance company, they confirmed that Margaret Lofty had taken out a life insurance policy worth around £700 with her new husband as sole beneficiary. The inspector also found that Alice Smith had taken out a similar life insurance policy shortly before she died, hoping that George, or as he called himself, Mr. Lloyd, would want to collect the money. Inspector Neal instructed the doctor to issue a favorable report to the insurance company. On the 1st of February 1915, a man fitting the description of both Smith and Lloyd appeared to collect the money. Inspector Neal was there. Inspector Neal asked if he was John Lloyd. He confirmed this, but when asked if he was also George Smith, he vigorously denied this, but was nevertheless arrested for making a false entry on a marriage certificate. While George was in custody, Home Office pathologist Bernard Spilsbury was tasked with exhuming the victims and establishing whether they drowned, and if this was the case, whether they drowned by force. No evidence was found of foul play, but the fact that Bessie Munday was still holding on to a bar of soap when she died was interesting, as if she really had suffered a fit or fainted. As the inquest had suggested, her hand would have relaxed and let the soap go. This suggested that she, and by implication the other women, had died very suddenly without time to put up a fight. The big question, however, was how did George drown his wives without them screaming or putting up a fight? The theory Spilsbury came up with was that George had pulled their legs so quickly out of the bath. He sent their heads underwater so fast, but they lost consciousness instantly. Modern science gives some credibility to this theory. Other people suggested, but George had first hypnotized his victims. George Joseph Smith was formally charged with the 3 murders and went on trial at the Old Bailey in London on June 22, 1915. Although he could only be tried for the murder of Bessie Williams in accordance with English law, the prosecution used the deaths of the other 2 to establish a pattern of George's crimes. This was allowed by Mr. Justice Scruton despite the protests of George's counsel. George decided not to give evidence in his own defense. Caroline Thornhill, who was still George's lawful wife, turned up to watch the trial. George was very confident of acquittal, although he lost his temper at one point, telling the court during police evidence that he had not committed murder and could not be sentenced to death. Then came the testimony of Dr. Spilsbury. The bath used for the murder of Alice Burnham was produced, and the pathologist prepared to demonstrate how, in his view, George had drowned his brides. The jury were taken to a private room to see a young woman model wearing a bathing costume. She stepped and reclined into the bath. Dr. Spilsbury then suddenly raised her legs and the water rushed up her nose and into her mouth. It was so effective that she had to be revived by artificial resuscitation. There was no doubt that George Smith had both the motivation and the character to commit this trio of murders. After an 8-day trial, the jury took just 22 minutes to find George guilty, and he was sentenced to death. George appealed against the verdict, but the appeal was dismissed. On the 13th of August, 1915, George was hanged in Maidstone prison, protesting his innocence to the end and taking with him the secret of how he killed his 3 wives. Guy was first registered as Guy Rampillon after his birth to a single mother at Vitré-la-France, eastern France, on October 10, 1962. His birth certificate states that he was born in the central city of Anjou on the 15th of October of the same year. But this is incorrect. His father is described as Inconnu, which means unknown, although it is now established that he lived with Guy's mother for some time and was an American soldier named George Cartwright who worked as a cook on the NATO bases. Guy's mother, Helene, abandoned him to state custody at the age of 6 because she wanted to marry a U.S. serviceman and emigrate to California, where she lives today. She took with her another son, Stephen. who was 3 years older than his brother and conceived with another American serviceman. Guy's mother, Helene, was from a French military family. Her father was a retired NCO and he fostered his daughter's first child, Stefan, until she emigrated. But he refused to foster Guy. For him, it was bad enough that his daughter had produced one child out of wedlock due to her fascination for Americans in uniform. But in her small town of Anjou, there was a social stigma attached to a woman who has had 2 children without being married. By this time, Guy was 6 years old and he was taken in by the French Social Welfare Service to be placed with a foster family. In an attempt to aid his adoption, he was given the surname Georges after his father. He was adopted by a family named Morin and grew up in a family of 12 adopted children. The young Guy never really received the love and attention and stability he needed and soon began to show a violent and aggressive streak. At the time in France, the condition of a foster family was to issue a new birth certificate with false details to prevent the child from discovering their origins. This procedure was used for decades, but now in France it is eventually banned, as it is against basic human rights. Guy would go through the next 32 years of his life wondering who his father was. Guy was very close to his Catholic foster mother, who was rewarded in France for bringing up 12 foster children in addition to 7 of her own. But in pre-adolescence, he began to steal from the family food store, more significantly acquired a knife to hunt and kill animals in the countryside behind his village home. By the age of 16, he had attacked 2 of his foster sisters, not for sexual reasons, but was sent to the state orphanage for adolescents. At 17, he was jailed for stealing a woman's handbag after ripping her face open with a knife. For this, he went to prison. A month after his 19th birthday, Guy committed his first rape. It was now the November 16, 1981, and he attacked a neighbor named Natalie when she was returning home. He raped her, stabbed her, and left her for dead. Incredibly, Natalie survived the attack. His next known crime was committed on the June 7, 1982 in a car park where he raped, stabbed, and strangled a young French woman named Violette. But again, she managed to escape and she went to the police. A few days later, Guy was arrested and sentenced to 18 months in prison. He was released in early 1984 and soon after his release he attacked a 21-year-old girl named Pascal, again in a car park. He raped and stabbed her. She managed to break free and run away. Later that evening, police again arrested Guy. The French sentenced him to 10 years in prison. Guy was undoubtedly a person who was a danger to women. But due to his good behavior, the French court allowed him out of prison during the day. But he was required to report back each evening to spend the night in the cell. On the evening of the 24th of January, 1991, Guy did not report back to prison and instead traveled to Paris. He spotted an attractive young woman walking down the road. It was 19-year-old Pascal Escafel, a student at the Sorbonne. He followed her home and grabbed her as she was opening her front door. Holding a knife to her throat, he forced his way in, tied her up and raped her before slitting her throat and watching her die. A week after the murder, Guy calmly returned to prison as if nothing had happened. He was released from prison and wasted no time in finding another young female victim. On the 22nd of April, 1992, just 18 days after his release, he attacked a young French female named Eleanor who escaped and reported the incident to the police. Guy was arrested once more and again returned to prison. At the end of 1993, even though Guy had attacked a young lady 18 days after his release from French authorities amazingly decided that he should be allowed back into society. Guy took no time to start his crime spree again. On the January 7, 1994, Guy attacked 27-year-old Catherine Rock in an underground parking garage. He raped and murdered her. 6 days later, he struck again. His victim was a French radio host named Annie, who he raped and murdered on the patio of her home. Guy then stopped killing for 10 months. But then on the November 9, 1994, in the underground parking garage of 22-year-old Elsa Benitez's home, he raped and killed her. A month later, the December 10, 1994, he raped and murdered a 33-year-old Dutch architect named Agnes Nitschkamp. In her home, the media began to report a killer in East Paris. In June 1995, Guy attacked another young lady named Elizabeth Ortega and despite his best attempts to kill her, she made a narrow escape. She did this by climbing through a ground floor window of her flat after having a lengthy conversation with him before he could assault her. She went to police and managed to give a vague description of her attacker. However, when she was eventually shown a picture of Guy, she failed to identify him. A few days later, on the 8th of July, 1995, he raped and murdered 27-year-old Helena Thrinking in her apartment after she returned from an evening out. His lust for rape and murder was now out of control, and a few weeks later he assaulted another young French girl, named Melanie, again in Paris. The media gave all the attacks a lot of coverage, and pressure was now on the police to find the culprit. The police, however, were failing. It was the press that alerted the country on the similarities between the murders. Journalists invented the description, the Bastille Killer, because two cases were located near the monument, and the authorities were eventually forced to accept that they had serial killer on the loose. It was claimed that the police didn't even question Helena Franklin's neighbors about the murder until 23 months after she was killed, and Elizabeth Ortega was shown a picture of her attacker over 2 years after she was attacked. So it's no wonder she failed to recognize him. It is also claimed that police ignored accurate descriptions from other survivors and witnesses. Some claim that the police were distracted in Paris due to a 1995 Paris metro bombing and the 1997 investigation into Princess Diana's death, when the entire force was mobilized to satisfy public opinion. On the 23rd of September 1997, Guy broke into the apartment of 19-year-old student Magali Cerati, and he raped and stabbed her to death. She was killed in the late afternoon, on her return from work in the flat where she lived with her fiancé. They were planning to get married in the spring, and her wedding dress was in the wardrobe. 5 days later, Guy assaulted a young French woman in the stairwell of her apartment block. Luckily, she managed to run away. His crimes continued, and less than a month after, on the 16th of November 1997, Guy entered the home of 25-year-old Estelle Magth. He raped, murdered her. The police investigation was finally gaining impetus, and investigators knew for certain that several of the unsolved crimes were linked and that they potentially had a serial killer on their hands. The media frenzy surrounding the killings had unleashed a level of panic in the population of Paris. Everyone now knew of the Beast of Bastille due to the fact that several of his attacks had occurred in this quarter of Paris. It was one of the largest manhunts in French criminal history. Police finally found Guy in Montmartre and arrested him on the March 27, 1998. It transpired that his DNA matched that found on 4 crime scenes, as well as 1 attempted rape. Confronted while in custody with this irrefutable DNA evidence, Guy confessed of these 4 murders as well as 3 others. He was kept in custody but tried to escape in December 2000. Few weeks before his trial was due to begin, he and 3 cellmates attempted to saw through the bars of the cell, but were caught by prison guards. Before his trial, Guy was assessed by psychiatrists, and he was declared legally sane. The media were all over the trial. They questioned how the French prison system that had diagnosed him as extremely dangerous nearly 20 years before had continually released him on the streets without treatment, money, or meaningful care. The media surmised that Guy's attempts to find out who his father was caused him stress. Before the trial began, the original birth certificate was released, and Guy was finally told his father's name and nationality. When he learned that his father was from the USA, it was as if he had been reborn. He leapt with joy. He retrieved the identity that he had been looking for all of his life. His father was from the USA, and knowing this raised his self-importance and self-confidence. The 3-week trial began on Monday, the 19th of March, 2001. The 50 witnesses included 4 women previously attacked and raped by Guy, members of the families of some of his victims, and his 71-year-old foster mother. Despite the prosecutor presenting the DNA evidence as well as the confession given after his arrest, Guy pleaded not guilty to all charges. He retracted his confession, claiming the police had tortured and beaten it out of him. 8 days into the proceedings, a defeated Guy broke down in tears and confessed. He admitted the original 4 murders as well as the rape and murder of Helena Franklin in 1995, Magali Cerati in 1997, and Estelle Magth in 1997, asking forgiveness from the victims' families. On Thursday, April 5, 2001, Guy Georges, by now 38 years old, was sentenced to life, possibility of parole after 22 years. This means that the people of Paris may see Guy Georges back on their streets in 2023. Amelia was born in 1838 in a small village of Pyle Marsh just east of Bristol. Bristol, for those of you unfamiliar with England, is on the River Severn, which separates England from Wales and is about 120 miles from London. Amelia was the youngest child of Samuel and Sarah Hobley and had 3 brothers and a sister. Her father worked as a master shoemaker. In her early years, she was a good student and very much liked literature and poetry. Sadly, during this time her mother suffered mental illness caused by typhus. Amelia witnessed her mother's violent fits and she cared for her mother until her mother's death in 1848. After her mother's death, Amelia went to live with an aunt in Bristol for a while and found work as a corset maker. And her eldest brother Thomas inherited the family shoe business. In 1861, at the age of 24, Amelia became permanently estranged from at least one of her brothers, James, and moved into lodgings in Trinity Street, Bristol. There she married George Thomas. George was 59, so 35 years her senior, so they lied about their ages on their marriage certificate to reduce the age gap. George deducted 11 years from his age and Amelia added 6 to hers. After her marriage, Amelia trained as a nurse. In Victorian Britain, this was considered a respectable occupation and enabled her to acquire useful skills. Life as a nurse, however, was hard. So through a contact with a midwife named Ellen Dane, Amelia learned an easier way to earn a living. Amelia started using her own home to provide shelter for young, unmarried women who were pregnant illegitimately and then farming off the babies for adoption or allowing them to die of neglect and malnutrition. Ellen Dane was forced to decamp to the USA shortly after meeting Amelia to escape the attention of the British authorities. In 1834, the Poor Law Amendment Act was passed, which meant that the fathers of illegitimate children no longer had any financial obligation to provide for the mother of the child. This made life very difficult for young, unmarried mothers and helped the growth of the practice known as baby farming, in which people such as Amelia Dyer acted as adoption or fostering agents in return for regular payment or a single upfront fee from the baby's mothers. Took in young women and cared for them until they gave birth, the mothers subsequently left their unwanted babies to be looked after as nurse children. The predicament of the parents involved was often exploited for financial gain. If a baby had well-off parents who were simply anxious to keep the birth secret, the single fee might be as much as £80. £50 might be negotiated if the father of the child wanted to keep his identity safe. Sadly, the majority of the young women were from poor backgrounds. These women were charged a lot less, such as £10. In 1870, £10 would be about £850 in today's money. Some carers resorted to starving the farmed-out babies. They did this to save money and even to hasten death. Many babies were noisy, so they were sedated with alcohol or opiates. Jeffrey's cordial, better known by its common name, mother's friend, was a syrup containing opium which would be given to babies. Many children died as a result of these medicines, and in the Victorian times, opium killed far more infants through starvation and directly through overdose. This was because when a baby is continually fed opium, they would not want to eat and die from malnutrition. This meant that when a coroner would produce a death certificate, they were most likely to record the death as debility from birth or lack of breast milk or simply starvation. Mothers who wanted to see their babies or whose circumstances had changed and wanted to reclaim their child could often encounter difficulties, and many would be too frightened or ashamed to tell the police about any suspected wrongdoing. Even the authorities often had problems tracing any children that were reported missing. This was the world opened up to Amelia. She had to leave nursing due to the birth of her daughter, Ellen Thomas. Then in 1869, her husband George Thomas died and Amelia needed an income. Amelia decided that baby farming could help her make money, especially as she had trained as a nurse. So she advertised to nurse and adopt babies in return for a substantial one-off payment and adequate clothing for the child. In her advertisements and meetings with clients, she assured them that she was respectable, married, and that she would provide a safe and loving home for the child. At some point in her baby farming career, Amelia was prepared to forego the expense and inconvenience of letting the children die for neglect and starvation. And soon after receipt of each child, she murdered them, thus allowing her to pocket most or all of the entire fee. Amelia Dyer evaded any police investigation for a long time until she was eventually caught in 1879 after a doctor was suspicious about the number of child deaths he had been called to certify in her care. Strangely though, she was not convicted of murder or manslaughter, but instead sentenced to 6 months hard labor for neglect. After serving her 6-month sentence, she had spells in mental hospitals due to her alleged mental instability. These always, however, coincided with times when it was convenient for her to disappear. Being a former asylum nurse, Amelia knew how to behave to ensure a relatively comfortable existence in an asylum. It appears that Amelia began abusing alcohol and opium-based products early in her killing career. Her mental instability could have been related to her substance abuse. In 1890, Amelia cared for the illegitimate baby of a governess. When the governess returned to visit her baby, she became suspicious and stripped the baby to see if a birthmark was present on its hips. It wasn't. The governess reported this to the authorities. And when the authorities started to investigate, Amelia drank 2 bottles of laudanum in a serious suicide attempt, but her long-term abuse had built up a tolerance to opium products, so she survived and was not prosecuted due to lack of evidence. Of course, she returned to baby farming and murder. Amelia decided that she did not want to involve doctors to issue death certificates and began disposing of the bodies herself. Precarious nature and extent of her activities again prompted undesirable attention. She was alert to the attentions of the police and of parents seeking to reclaim their children. She and her family frequently relocated to different towns and cities to escape suspicion, regain anonymity, and to acquire new business. Over the years, Amelia used many different identities. In 1895, Amelia moved to Caversham, Berkshire, accompanied by an unsuspecting associate, J. Granny Smith, whom Amelia had recruited from a brief spell in a workhouse, and Amelia's daughter, Mary, and also known as Polly, and her son-in-law, Arthur Palmer. This was followed by a move to Kensington Road, Reading, Berkshire, later the same year. Smith was persuaded by Amelia to be referred to as mother, in front of innocent women handing over their children. This was an effort to present a caring mother-daughter image. In January 1896, a 25-year-old barmaid named Evelina Marmon gave birth to an illegitimate daughter, Doris, in a boarding house in Cheltenham. She was unable to raise the child alone, so sought offers of adoption and placed an advertisement in that miscellaneous section of the Bristol Times and Mirror newspaper. It simply read, "Wanted respectable woman to take young child." Evelina intended to go back to work and hoped eventually to reclaim her child. The advertisement next to her own was one placed by Amelia Dyer, which read, "Married couple with no family would adopt healthy child, nice country home, terms £10. Evelina responded to a Mrs. Harding, and a few days later she received a reply from Amelia from Oxford Road in Reading. Mrs. Harding wrote, "I should be glad to have a dear little baby girl, one I could bring up and call my own." She continued, "We are a plain, homely people in fairly good circumstances. I don't want a child for money's sake, but for company and home comfort. Myself and my husband are dearly fond of children. I have no child of my own. A child with me will have a good home and a mother's love. Pay a more affordable weekly fee for the care of her daughter," but Mrs. Harding insisted on being given the one-off payment in advance. Evelina was not in a very good social or economic position, so she reluctantly agreed to pay the £10. And a week later Mrs. Harding arrived in Cheltenham. Evelina was surprised by Amelia's advanced age and appearance, but Amelia seemed affectionate towards Doris. Evelina handed over her daughter, together with a cardboard box of clothes and the £10. She was very upset at having to give up care of her daughter and accompanied Amelia to Chatham Station. She returned to her lodgings very emotional at having to give up her baby daughter. A few days later, she received a letter from Mrs. Harding saying all was well. Evelina wrote back but received no reply. However, Amelia Dyer had not traveled where she had told Evelina she was going. Instead, she had gone to 76 Mayo Road, Willesden, London, where her 23-year-old daughter Polly was staying. There, Amelia found some white edging tape, using dressmaking, wound it twice around the baby's neck and tied a knot and murdered her. Amelia and her daughter Polly allegedly helped to wrap the body in a napkin. They kept some of the clothes Evelina had packed and sold the rest to the local pawnbroker. Amelia paid the rent to her landlady and gave her a pair of child boots as a present for her little girl. The following day, Wednesday the 1st of April 1896, another child named Harry Simmons was taken to Mayo Road. However, with no spare white edging tape available, the tape around Doris' corpse was removed and used to strangle the 13-month-old boy. On April 2nd, both bodies were stacked into a carpet bag along with bricks for added weight. Amelia then headed for Reading. At a selected spot she knew well, near Caversham Lock, she forced the carpet bag through railings into the River Thames. 3 days before, on the 30th of March, 1896, a package was retrieved from the Thames at Reading Bar Bargeman. It contained the body of a baby girl, later identified as Helena Fry. The package was given to Reading Borough Police, who found a label from the Temple Mead Station, Bristol. With microscopic analysis of the wrapping paper, deciphered a faintly legible name, Mrs. Thomas, and an address. The evidence led police to Amelia Dyer, but they still had no strong evidence to connect her directly with any involvement with the baby in the river. The police decided to put Amelia under surveillance. The police used a young woman as a decoy, hoping she would be able to secure a meeting with Amelia to discuss her services. A meeting was arranged for April the 3rd, Good Friday, but instead of the decoy turning up, it was the Reading police who arrived at Amelia's house. When searching her home, they were apparently struck by the stench of human decomposition. Although no human remains were found in the house, plenty of other related evidence including white edging tape, telegrams regarding adoption arrangements, porn tickets for children's clothing, receipts for advertisements, and letters from mothers inquiring about the well-being of their children. Previous few months alone, at least 20 children had been placed in the care of Mrs. Thomas, now revealed to be Amelia Dyer. It also appeared that she was about to move home again, this time to Somerset. This rate of murder has led some to estimate that Mrs. Dyer may, over the course of decades, have killed over 400 babies and children, making her one of the most prolific murderers ever. It is believed that Amelia arrived home carrying a brown paper parcel. She hid the package in the house, but after 3 weeks of odor and decomposition prompted her to dump the dead baby in the river. As it was not weighed adequately, it had been easily spotted. Amelia was arrested on April 4th and charged with murder. Her son-in-law, Arthur Palmer, was charged as an accessory. During April, the Thames was dredged and 6 more bodies were discovered, including Doris Marmon, Harry Simmons, Amelia's last victims. Each baby had been strangled with white tape. 11 days after handing her daughter to Amelia Dyer, Evelina Marmon, whose name had emerged in items kept by Amelia, identified her daughter's remains. At the inquest into the deaths in early May, no evidence was found that Mary and/or Arthur Palmer had acted as Amelia Dyer's accomplices. Arthur Palmer was discharged as a result of a confession written by Amelia Dyer. On the 22nd of May, 1896, Amelia Dyer appeared at the Old Bailey and pleaded guilty to one murder, that of Doris Marmon. Her family and associates testified at her trial. They had been growing suspicious and uneasy about her activities, and it emerged that she had narrowly escaped discovery on several occasions. Evidence from a man who had seen and spoken to her when she had disposed of 2 bodies in Caversham Loch also proved significant. Also, her own daughter had given graphic evidence that ensured Amelia Dyer's conviction. The only defense Amelia Dyer offered was insanity. She had been twice committed to asylums in Bristol. However, the prosecution argued successfully that her mental instability had been a ploy to avoid suspicion. Both committals were said to have coincided with times when Amelia was concerned her crimes might have been exposed. It took the jury only 4.5 minutes to find her guilty. In her 3 weeks in a condemned cell, she filled 5 exercise books with her last true and only confession. She was visited the night before her execution by a chaplain and asked if she had anything to confess. She offered him her exercise book, saying, "Isn't this enough?" Amelia Dyer was hanged at Newgate Prison on Wednesday, June 10, 1896. Asked on the scaffold if she had anything to say, she said, "I have nothing to say." It is uncertain how many more children Amelia Dyer murdered. However, inquiries from mothers, evidence of other witnesses, and material found in Amelia's homes, including letters and many babies' clothes, pointed to many more. The Amelia Dyer case caused a scandal in Victorian Britain, and she became known as the Ogres of Reading. Subsequently, adoption laws in Britain were made stricter, giving local authorities the power to police baby farms in the hope of stamping out abuse. Despite this and the scrutinizing of newspapers' personal ads, the trafficking and abuse of infants did not stop. 2 years after Amelia Dyer's execution, railway workers inspecting carriages at Newton Abbot, Devon, found a parcel. Inside was a 3-week-old girl. She was cold and wet, but she was alive. A lady named Jane Hill had given the baby to a Mrs. Stewart for £12. Mrs. Stewart had picked up the baby in Plymouth and apparently dumped her on the next train. It is claimed that Mrs. Stewart was Polly, the daughter of Amelia Dyer. Herbert Rouse Armstrong was born in 1870 at Newton Abbot in Devon. He did not come from a wealthy background, but obtained a good education and went to Cambridge University. He graduated in law and became a solicitor in 1895. His first position was in his hometown of Newton Abbot. Later, he moved to Liverpool. Then, in 1906, Herbert took up a position in a town called Hay. Here he put some of his savings into a partnership, and when the oldest of the partners died, he succeeded to the practice. Being a partner certainly improved Herbert's finances. So much so that he married a friend from his Newton Abbot days. They moved into a house into the valley of Cussop Dingle. The stream of this valley formed part of the border between England and Wales. They had 3 children in as many years before moving into a larger house in 1910, which was also located in Cussop Dingle. Herbert loved his garden and was obsessed with eradicating garden weeds. After he read about how to eradicate dandelions, it became a particular practice of his to put small portions of arsenic into individual pouches, which he then squirted into the ground near the dandelions, which eradicated them. Herbert worked from a rather plain business premises in Broad Street, Hay, which was part of a shop. The remaining portion was occupied by a firm of estate agents. Across the street were the offices of Mr. Griffiths, who was a solicitor. Mr. Griffiths was Welsh and a local man, was considered a stranger to the small conservative town. However, his business was doing reasonably well. With the outbreak of the First World War in August 1914, Herbert, who had previously been a member of the Territorial Army, was called up to the rank of captain, and he was later promoted to major. After a short posting to France, he returned to the UK, which enabled him to again look after his practice in Hay. As the business grew, the business of his rival, Mr. Griffiths, was becoming less successful. So Herbert saw an opportunity to expand his business and offered to amalgamate the 2 practices. Mr. Griffiths, however, had other ideas, and in early 1919 took a partner named Mr. Oswald Norman Martin. This person is important to the story, so remember. Oswald Martin. At the end of 1920, Mr. Griffiths died, leaving Oswald Martin a sole partner in the practice. Herbert was just over 5 feet tall and only weighed 7 stone, which is about 98 pounds or 45 kilograms. He was dominated by his wife. Although she was a devoted wife and mother, she treated her husband and children with a strictness which denied them many harmless activities. For example, Herbert was only allowed to smoke in one room and never outdoors. He was not allowed to drink alcohol. During the period May 1920 and February 1921, a series of highly significant events occurred. Herbert was in London and he met with a lady he had previously met in 1915 while he was in the army. He had previously drawn up a new will for his wife, or at least a will in her name, in which she left everything to him with no provision for their children. During August 1920, Mrs. Armstrong's physical and mental health deteriorated to such an extent that she was admitted to the Barnwood Asylum in Gloucester. And her husband Herbert, she was discharged from the asylum and returned home on the 22nd of January. It was during January 1921 that Herbert made another purchase of £1/4 pound of arsenic. On the 11th of January 1921, he made what was to be his last purchase of arsenic. Now this is very important. He made the purchase at a chemist shop which was owned by his rival solicitor, Mr. Martin's prospective father-in-law, named Mr. Davis. Mrs. Armstrong returned home. She died. It was February 22, 1921. Her doctor, Dr. Hinks, certified her cause of death to have been heart disease. 3 days later, Mrs. Armstrong was buried in the church at Cussop. After Mrs. Armstrong's death, life at Mayfield went on very much as it was before, but Herbert was now master of his own home. He still had a housekeeper and a maid. His youngest child was at home and he had the companionship of school friends during the school holidays. Herbert's practice had continued to develop. He was now clerk of the Justice of Hay, Breadward Line, and Payne Castle. And in addition to these posts, he was hopeful of being appointed to a similar position with the bench at Talgarth. The only business worry was Mr. Martin, who was pressing Herbert to complete the long overdue formalities arising out of the sale of a property in which there was a matter of £500 paid to Herbert as a deposit. Around the time that he was pressing for the completion of the property, Mr. Martin was anonymously sent a box of chocolates to his home. Mr. Martin ate some of the chocolates. They were later produced at a dinner party held by Mr. and Mrs. Martin. One of the guests was taken ill, and after examination it was discovered that arsenic had been inserted through holes pierced in the base of the sweets. Later these holes were found to correspond with the nozzle of the weed eradicator used by Herbert. Suddenly professional relations between Martin and Herbert improved, as the closing of the building sales seemed to be drawing to a close. On the 26th of October, 1921, Herbert invited Martin to visit his house for afternoon tea. During tea, Herbert passed Martin a scone, apologizing for using his fingers. The contracts and the £500 were not discussed, although Martin could have raised the subject. Later that evening, after returning home, Martin became ill. Who had treated Mrs. Armstrong called at the Martins' house early the next morning. He found Martin in bed with a severe bilious attack and a very rapid pulse. Dr. Hinks made daily calls to examine Martin, who was slowly improving. but he still had a high pulse rate on October 31, 1921. Dr. Hinks sent a sample of Martin's urine to the Clinical Research Association for analysis. A week later, when Martin had recovered sufficiently to return to work, the results arrived with Dr. Hinks. The report stated that the urine sample contained 1/33 of a grain of arsenic. Dr. Hinks knew that none of the medicines prescribed by him for Martin contained arsenic. He had questioned Martin about the food he had consumed immediately before his illness started. He knew that Martin had eaten lunch on the 26th of October, 1921, which had been shared by Mrs. Martin and their maid. Both these ladies were fine and had suffered no ill effects. Dr. Hinks was struck by the similarities between Martin's illness and the illness suffered by Mrs. Armstrong in the period leading up to her admission to Barnwood Asylum. Dr. Hinks' suspicions were raised when he contacted the asylum, and doctors there confirmed that they may have also been misled as to Mrs. Armstrong's physical ailments. Dr. Hinks then forwarded his concerns to the Home Office in London. Dr. Hinks kept his concerns to himself, although he did warn Martin. The authorities eventually decided to take action on Dr. Hinks' suspicions. But the investigations had to be conducted carefully. If Herbert was guilty, they could not afford to alarm him. If he was innocent, then they could not afford to cause unnecessary scandal. The investigating police officers, led by Chief Detective Inspector Crutchett, went to Hay after dark and made discreet calls on Mr. and Mrs. Martin, Dr. Hinks, and Mr. Davis being the chemist and Martin's father-in-law. During the period from Martin's return to work until Christmas 1921, Herbert made numerous attempts to invite both Martin and his wife to visit him for tea. Martin, who was aware of the police investigations, repeatedly declined the invitations. 1922, Mrs. Armstrong was exhumed and the pathologist Bernard Spilsbury removed some samples before she was reburied. The samples were examined and found to contain 3.5 grains of arsenic. On the 19th of January, 1922, Herbert Armstrong was charged with the murder of his wife. His trial was at Hereford, and the judge was Mr. Justice Darling, who had a reputation of being a hanging judge. During the 10-day trial, which started in April 1922, Herbert was kept in Gloucester prison. Every day of the trial, he was taken to court. On the first day, the 3rd of April, 1922, a legal debate took place. With the trial jury removed, the legal argument concerned the omission of evidence regarding the poisoning of Martin. Although Armstrong had been charged with poisoning Martin, the case had gone no further. Mr. Justice Darling ruled that evidence regarding the Martin case could be omitted. He later stated in his summing up that the defendant had arsenic in his possession and that he would use it to poison a human being. During the trial, the defense claimed that Mrs. Armstrong had been suicidal and that she had finally committed suicide by swallowing the arsenic which she found that her husband had purchased to kill the garden weeds. This was countered by the prosecution, showing that Mrs. Armstrong was not capable of leaving her bed in the week before her death and that she had said to her nurse on the morning of the day she died, "I'm not going to die, am I? Because I have everything to live for. My children and my husband." The lady who first met Herbert in Christchurch and later in London 3 months after Mrs. Armstrong's death testified to the prosecution that Herbert had spoken to her about marriage. Bernard Spilsbury testified that the amount of arsenic in Mrs. Armstrong's body could only have occurred through poisoning. Mrs. Armstrong's own doctor, Dr. Hinks, testified that she could have any medicine herself on the day of her death. It was to be expected that a well-educated and professional man like Herbert Armstrong, who was also worshipful master of the Hay Lodge of Freemasons and a churchwarden who read the lessons on Sunday, would testify in his own defense. After completing his testimony and cross-examination, Herbert was about to leave the witness box when the judge asked him to wait, as he had some questions to put to him. The judge's questions exposed the inaccuracies of Herbert's earlier replies. It was presented in the earlier prosecution evidence that he had made up some 20 small bags of arsenic, as he stated, to put into individual dandelion holes to kill these weeds. Now, the judge asked why he had done that when it would have been easier to pour from the original packet into holes in the ground. Armstrong replied, "I really do not know. At the time it seemed the most convenient way of doing it." The judge continued by asking why Armstrong, who was a solicitor by profession, why did he not tell the police earlier about the 2 packets found in his desk at home? The questions continued to be asked by the judge, and Herbert was showing more signs of floundering as the judge's questions continued. After the prosecution and defense had been completed, the judge summed up the case for the 12-man jury, which was composed of 8 farmers, a fruit grower, and 3 professional gentlemen. The judge stated that the possession of the 2 bags of arsenic in Herbert's desk showed just possession of arsenic and nothing else. The main point was the state of Mrs. Armstrong in her last few days before her death at her home. Mr. Justice Darling also reminded the jury that if it was wrong for him to have allowed the evidence of Martin's poisoning, then this was a matter for the Court of Criminal Appeal should Armstrong be found guilty. Armstrong was found guilty of murdering his wife and sentenced to death by hanging. Major Herbert Armstrong was hanged in his best tweed suit, the only English solicitor to go to the gallows. 70 years later, however, doubts over his guilt started to surface. There were suggestions that Mrs. Armstrong may have dosed herself accidentally with her husband's arsenic. The chemist Herbert bought it from was Oswald Martin's father-in-law, and he had a double grudge against Major Armstrong. Not only had Major Armstrong helped a rival chemist set up a practice in Hay, he also posed a threat to his son-in-law, who wanted a monopoly on the Hay legal affairs. We will probably never know if Major Herbert Armstrong was truly guilty or if he suffered a gross carriage of misjustice. Before we proceed, I've got an exciting surprise for you. We've launched a brand new channel dedicated to intriguing content such as old historical mysteries, cold cases, and particularly chilling horror stories perfect for bedtime. Drop a comment letting us know if you're a fan of horror stories or not. You can find the link in the description below. Let's find out who will be the first to explore it. Alright, let's dive back into the video. Childhood was hard. He was born on October the 8th, 1948 in Tolima, Colombia, which at the time was politically unstable and had the highest crime rate in the world. He was the 7th of 13 children born to a Colombian prostitute. His father, Medardo Reyes, was a member of the country. Pedro's mother, Belinda, was 3 months pregnant with Pedro at the time of his father's death. When Pedro was 8, his mother caught him touching his sister, so threw him out of the house. Other accounts, however, say that he ran away of his own accord. So 8-year-old Pedro was living in the Colombian streets. One day he was offered food and shelter by a sympathetic Colombian, but the 8-year-old was taken to an abandoned building and repeatedly sexually assaulted before being put back on the streets. It is thought that this attack had a major influence on Pedro's later life of crime. After being assaulted in Tolima by the pedophile, Pedro became very aware of strangers. He stayed out of sight during the day and looked for food at night. Soon after his ordeal, he left and traveled to the Colombian capital, Bogotá. In Bogotá, he was helped by an American couple who took him to their home and enrolled him in a school for orphans. But when he was 12, a male teacher molested him. Pedro then went back to his life on the Bogotá streets. As Pedro got older, he graduated from small crimes such as stealing food to larger crimes such as stealing cars and selling them to chop shops. Now, chop shops are places that would break up the car and sell on the parts. At the time, it brought in a good income for Pedro, but at 18, he was arrested and sent to prison for car theft. In prison, he was set upon by 4 inmates and gang raped. This made him so upset and angry that it was allegedly consuming him. He then killed 3 of the 4 men responsible. The Colombian authorities added a mere 2 years to his sentence as they judged his actions to be self-defense. During his time in prison, he thought a lot about his life and childhood and developed a rage towards his mother who had put him out on the streets. He was also fascinated with pornographic magazines. His memories of his prostitute mother and pornography started to feed Pedro's demented hatred of women. Pedro was released from prison in 1978 and moved to Peru, where he began kidnapping and killing young Peruvian girls. These girls were usually of indigenous background and with limited economic means. He was eventually caught by a group of Indians who tortured him and buried him up to his neck in sand. Fortunately for Pedro, an American missionary was passing and persuaded them to release him to the Peruvian authorities, which they reluctantly agreed to do. The Peruvian police, however, did not want to get involved with what they considered to be a trivial local complaint, so deported him to Colombia without truly considering the crimes inflicted upon Peruvian citizens and the danger he posed to society. The near-death experience did nothing to stop his murderous ways, and his killing of young girls continued. Ambato, Ecuador, is built on the banks of the Ambato River in a valley surrounded by mountains, and in 1980 the people were celebrating the Festival of Fruits and Flowers, which is one of the most important festivals in Ecuador. However, their celebrations were muted as girls between the ages of 8 and 12 had gone missing. The increase of missing girls was noticed by authorities, but it was concluded that they had probably been kidnapped by child peddlers or sold as sex slaves or had just ran away as they had not been doing so well at school. That year in Ambato there was unseasonal high rainfall which resulted in a flood, and this exposed the bodies of 4 murdered children. Only now did Ecuadorian authorities realize there was a serial killer at large. The police didn't have many resources or leads in order to catch the killer. They would even need the public to be vigilant or have luck on their side. A few days later they got their breakthrough at the Plaza Rosa marketplace in Ambato. Carvina Povera saw a man leaving the plaza with her 12-year-old daughter Maria. She shouted loudly at the man who was later discovered to be Pedro, and he was captured by the townspeople. He was taken to the police station, and soon the police realized that they had a madman in their custody. Pedro, however, refused to answer any questions, so they decided to enlist for help of a local priest. They dressed him as a prisoner and placed him in a cell with Pedro. The priest soon got Pedro talking, and he soon shared his brutal crimes with his new cellmate. When Pedro was confronted by the police about the crimes he shared with his cellmate, he broke down and confessed. His memory of his crimes was very clear, which was remarkable since he confessed to killing at least 110 children in Ecuador, over 100 more in Colombia, and another 100 in Peru. Pedro admitted that he would walk the streets looking for innocent good girls, and he would lure them away with the promise of "I like the girls in Ecuador." He told police they are more gentle and trusting, more innocent. They are not as suspicious of strangers as Colombian girls. They never scream, they expect nothing, they are innocent, he said. Pedro usually prepared graves in advance, sometimes filled with the lost his innocence at age 8, so he had decided to do the same to as many young girls as he could. He would walk around markets in villages looking for selected targets with a certain look of innocence. Pedro first raped his victims, then stared into their eyes as he strangled them. Deriving sadistic pleasure from watching them die, he hunted his victims by daylight, then he would always calm his victims with soft, reassuring words throughout the night. Then at sunrise he would rape and strangle them, satisfying his sexual needs as he watched their eyes fade as they died. He never killed at night because he could not see the victim's eyes, and he felt without that element the murder was a waste. In Pedro's confession he told of having tea parties and playing morbid games with the dead children. He would prop them up in their graves and talk to them, convincing himself that his little friends liked the company, but when the dead children failed to answer he would become bored and go off to find another victim. Police were initially skeptical of their suspect's gruesome claims, but doubts evaporated after Pedro led detectives to 53 graves in the vicinity of Ambato. He stood by in irons as the police unearthed the remains of girls aged 8 to 12 at 28 other sites. Searches came up empty. This was probably due to the bodies being taken by predatory animals, but the police were now convinced of Pedro's guilt. The public renamed Pedro the Monster of the Andes. The trial started on the 31st of July, 1981. Pedro was now 33 years old, and he pleaded guilty to the murder of 57 girls and was imprisoned in Ambato, where he was officially diagnosed as a sociopath. Because of Ecuador's laws, he received the maximum jail sentence, which at the time was 16 years. Ecuador would later change its maximum prison sentence to 25 years, so this meant for one child's life. Pedro served 1 month in prison. However, no one was concerned that Pedro would the opportunity to kill again. If paroled from prison in Ecuador, he would still have to stand trial for his murders in Colombia and Peru. Pedro never showed remorse for his crimes. In a prison interview with a journalist, he said that if he got out of prison, he would happily return to killing young children. The pleasure he received from his demented acts of murder overpowered any sense of right from wrong, and he admittedly looked forward to the opportunity to wrap his hands around the throat of his next victim. After 14 years in prison in Ecuador, Pedro was released. He was released 2 years early for good behavior and deported to Colombia, his homeland, where authorities attempted to convict him for a 2-decade-old murder, but instead he was declared insane and in 1995 institutionalized in a psychiatric facility. 3 years later, in February 1998, he was declared sane and released under a $50 bail with 1 or 2 other additional stipulations. He then went and visited his elderly mother and asked for his inheritance. He was informed, but she was living in poverty, so he sold her sofa bed and chair to people on the streets, and he vanished. Pedro has not been seen again. Whatever happened to the monster of the Andes is unknown. Many believe that one of the many bounties offered for his death eventually paid off. There is, however, no proof that he has died. Pedro Alonso Lopez was responsible for the murders of over 350 children, yet in 1998 he was set free despite his vows to kill again. In Britain, the Georgian period was between 1714 and 1830, and this crime was committed very early in the Georgian period in 1725, so nearly 300 years ago, and 104 years before the Metropolitan Police Act of 1829 established a full-time professional police force in London. It was considered that in Georgian Britain, men were more valuable in law than women. So if a woman killed her husband, she was guilty not merely of murder, but the much more serious crime of petty treason. Petty treason was defined by the Treason Act of 1351 and encompassed the killing of a master by a servant, a husband by his wife, or a superior by his inferior. These crimes were seen both as an assault on the majesty of the state as well as the actual victim and were perceived at the time to be against the natural order of things. This meant that the punishment for petty treason was much more severe than for ordinary murder. Women were burned at the stake and men could be hanged, drawn, and quartered, these also being the respective punishments for high treason. Catherine was born in Birmingham, England in 1690. When she was 15 years old, she ran away from home. As a 15-year-old in 1705, it was difficult to survive. But Catherine was a very pretty girl and found her way into prostitution. She was employed to look after the needs of a group of army officers in Worcestershire. But after a while, they tired of her services. She spent the next few years working in prostitution or, when she could, as a maid in domestic service. Catherine had a relationship with a local tanner and gave birth to a son named Thomas. At the age of 23, she secured a position as a housemaid to a local gentleman farmer named Hayes. Mr. Hayes had 2 sons, and it didn't take long for Catherine to seduce the older one. He was 21-year-old John. John fell for Catherine and they married in secret and started living in a cottage on his father's farm. For the first 6 months of the marriage, it seemed to go quite well. John was working long hours on the farm where Catherine was at home. Catherine, however, needed to amuse herself. So she started to have relationships with other men. The couple lived a very rural life on the farm, which is very different to Catherine's childhood in the city of Birmingham. In 1719, Catherine persuaded John to move to London. This they did, and John set up a business as a coal merchant, pawnbroker, and moneylender. The business did very well, and Catherine was given a generous allowance, including servants. This, however, was not enough to satisfy her, and she constantly asked John for more. He was growing tired of his wife's demands, and decided she was spending too much money, so reduced her allowance. By the year 1725, the marriage began to go downhill. Coincidentally, at the same time, the couple had taken in a lodger who was a young tailor, 18-year-old Thomas Billings, who was, in fact, Catherine's illegitimate son. She started to have an incestuous affair with Thomas. They then took in another lodger, also called Thomas Wood, who was a friend of Catherine's husband John and was a butcher by trade. It was not long before Catherine was also having a relationship with him. So now, to put it into context, living in the house, we have Catherine, her husband John, Catherine's illegitimate son, Thomas Billings, a tailor, and Thomas Wood, who was a butcher. Catherine decided that she no longer wanted to be married to her husband. She could have left him. Nevertheless, in Georgia and Britain, this would mean giving up all of the luxuries and comfortable life she had become accustomed to leading. Instead, she decided she would have to kill him. Using all of her charms, she persuaded the 2 lodgers to help her end her husband's life. On the 1st of March, 1725, John went out drinking to a local pub with the 2 lodgers, and they took bets on who could drink the most and remain sober. When they all got home, Catherine's husband John was very drunk, so he went to bed. When he was finally asleep, Thomas Billings, Catherine's illegitimate son, entered his bedroom and hit John on the head with an axe. John let out screams, which were heard by the lady who rented the rooms above. Mrs. Springate, she immediately came down to inquire about the noise, but Catherine told her they'd been having a party and Mrs. Springate returned to her room. Thomas Wood then helped Thomas Billings finish off John with the axe. They all decided that it would be best to ensure that John's body was unidentifiable, so they cut off his head and wrapped it in a cloth. They then put it in a bucket. As Thomas Wood was a butcher, he sliced up the rest of John's body. They then had to get rid of the evidence, so waited until it was dark and removed a sliced-up body from the house. They took it to a nearby pond in Marylebone Fields. They then went to Millbank and threw the head into the River Thames. Their plan, however, was not well thought out, and they had not made sure that the head sunk to the bottom of the river. So it was soon recovered by local boatmen who in horror reported his findings to the constable. It was taken to be examined, where the skull was found to be severely fractured in 2 places and the face terribly cut. Nobody could identify John's severed head, so it was placed on top of a wooden spike in St. Margaret's churchyard. Despite its appearance, it didn't take long for the head to be identified by 3 men as being that of John Hayes. One of the men who had identified John was a business associate named Mr. Ashby, who informed Catherine that he had been due to meet John to discuss some business, and John did not show up at the appointment or send word that he would not be there. Catherine insisted that her husband had been called away on urgent business. She was getting agitated, and this time she made up a story about John having killed a man in a fight and fleeing the country. Mr. Ashby didn't believe the story, so reported his suspicions to the authorities. In consequence of voicing his suspicions, Mr. Ashby returned to the Hayes household with several constables. When they arrived, to their surprise, they discovered Catherine in bed with Thomas Billings. The pair were both immediately arrested. Thomas would have temporarily escaped, but for some reason returned to London a few days later, where he too was arrested. The remains of John's body were later discovered on the 26th of March. The authorities also decided to arrest Mrs. Springate, although they soon realized that she had no part in the crime and was released. A coroner's inquest opened on the 16th of April, 1726 to investigate John's death. It brought in a verdict of willful murder, naming Catherine, Thomas Wood, and Thomas Billings as the people responsible. This was a very barbaric crime which shook early 18th century London and was widely reported in the newspapers and spoken about in the streets. The case was of special interest because it was one of the first recorded instances where a victim had been dismembered after death. The magistrate showed Catherine her husband's head, by now preserved in a jar of gin, and invited her to touch it. At the time, there was a superstition that if a murderer touched the head of the victim, their guilt would be revealed. Catherine, being aware of this, was quite happy to touch John's head and put on a show of grief for the magistrate. However, she was remanded in Newgate prison until her trial. Billings and Wood were kept separately from Catherine, and her illegitimate son Thomas continued to protest his innocence. When Thomas Wood had been arrested, he was cross-examined by the justices of the peace and confessed to his part in the crime, implicating Catherine and Billings. He told the justice that Catherine had given he and Billings the money to get her husband drunk, and that Billings had struck the fatal blow while he had cut up the body. Then also confessed her guilt and said that the devil had been in them and made them commit murder. The 3 came to trial at the April sessions of the Old Bailey in London, held between Wednesday 20th and Saturday April 23rd, before the Lord Mayor, the Recorder, and several other judges. The indictment against Catherine was for petty treason. Thomas Billings and Thomas Wood were simply charged with murder. Catherine maintained that she had not taken part in the actual killing, but held a candle for the men while they dismembered her husband. She also continued to maintain that the crime was the work of the devil through them. They were tried by a jury of 12 men who heard evidence of the murder, and they returned a verdict of guilty against all 3 defendants. Billings and Wood were sentenced to be hanged at Tyburn and afterwards to be hanged in chains, and Catherine, having been found guilty of petty treason, was sentenced to be drawn to Tyburn on a hurdle, and there be burned alive at the stake. She was greatly distressed by her sentence, as were her 2 co-defendants who begged just to be hanged. Catherine and her fellow condemned were lodged in the condemned hold at Newgate prison, where she reaffirmed her confession but protested for severity of her sentence. She accepted that she deserved to die for her crimes, but very distressed by the thought of the way she would be executed. The executions were set for Monday the 9th of May, 1726, and drew the usual huge crowd, particularly as a woman was to be burnt. In the press yard at Newgate that day there were 9 men and Catherine waiting to be executed. Their irons were removed, and the yeoman of the halter put the nooses around the men's necks prior to loading them in the carts, where they sat on their coffins for the journey to Tyburn. When they reached Tyburn, the 3 carts were backed under the beams, and the hangman secured each man in turn. When they finished their prayers, the carts were moved from under them, leaving them suspended. Catherine was of course able to watch the men die, one of which was her son, Thomas Billings. Attention now turned to her execution. She was secured to a stake set in the ground a few yards from the gallows. The cord put around her neck and passed through a hole bored in the stake for the purpose of strangling her in accordance with the normal practice of the time. 2 cartloads of sticks were piled around her, and at the signal the fire was lit. She begged the executioner to strangle her before the fire reached her, and he took the end of the cord and began to pull on it, but the flames blew in his direction, burning his hands, so he had to let go. Catherine reportedly gave 3 dreadful shrieks before she was engulfed by the fierce fire and fell silent. She was seen trying to push away the flames with her free hands, but to no avail. Reports claimed that the executioner, seeing her suffering, threw a large piece of wood at her head, which broke her skull and probably killed her. However, she would have suffered terrible burns and shot, and have been in horrific pain for some time before the fire or lack of oxygen created by it would have killed her. It was over an hour before her body was reduced to ashes. There is no memorial stone for Catherine Hayes. She goes down in history as a cold-blooded murderer who was burnt at a stake for the crime of killing her husband. Madeline Smith was born on March 29, 1835, and was the eldest child of an upper-middle-class family who lived in Glasgow, Scotland. Her father, James Smith, was an architect, and her mother, Janet, was the daughter of a leading neoclassical architect. The family lived at number 7, Blythewood Square, Glasgow, and also had a country property near Helensborough. Madeline was educated from an early age and was well accustomed to how to behave in Victorian society. As a young teenager, Madeline attended Mrs. Allen Gordon's Academy for Young Ladies, where she learned proper manners, how to play the piano, how to dance, and very importantly, how to act in society. When she was 18 years old, Madeline returned to Glasgow. It was now the summer of 1853. Pierre-Emile Louis-Guillard was born, the first of 5 children to French parents, born in the Channel Islands in April 1823. His family ran a seed merchant business, and it was very successful but restricted to French speakers, as the family had a poor level of English. Emile's father wanted to attract the business of wealthy English visitors who visited the island. So Emile was sent to be the apprentice of a seed business that worked mainly in English. Here, he became very fluent in the language. In 1842, Emile was approached by Sir Francis Mackenzie from Scotland to work on his Scottish estates. Emile took the position and went to work in the Scottish capital city of Edinburgh. Later, he left the position and moved to Glasgow, where he took a job as a warehouse clerk. It is not known when Emile first saw Madeline, but it was in Glasgow. It was probably early in 1855. Emile was instantly attracted to her, so he asked a mutual friend if he could be introduced. Madeline, the daughter of one of the most prominent families in Glasgow, met Emile, who was a warehouse clerk. Even though Madeline was well aware that a warehouse clerk would be an unacceptable companion for a young lady from a prominent Glasgow family, Madeline was attracted to Emile. And not long after their initial meeting, they started exchanging letters. The letters continued between them, and they met on many occasions in the street or at nearby shops. Soon, however, Madeline's father heard about the friendship and demanded that it stop. Madeline seemed to really have feelings for Emile, but reluctantly wrote to him ending their friendship. Emile, however, was not going to let me stop him seeing Madeline, so continued to write to her, and a friend of the couple, Miss Mary Perry, allowed them to meet secretly in her house. Madeline was now happy to continue the relationship with Emile, and the correspondence and meetings continued. As time went on, their romance intensified, and although they were keeping their relationship, got engaged. Emile kept all of Madeline's letters, but he insisted that Madeline burn the letters that he sent to her. They continued to meet at Mrs. Perry's and occasionally met late at night at Madeline's house when her family were asleep. Madeline's parents, not knowing that the relationship with Emile had continued, were looking for a suitable husband for her. Best match would be William Minnick, a wealthy merchant and neighbor of the Smiths. In September 1856, William Minnick stayed with the Smith family at their summer house on the Clyde, and he spent much time with Madeline. Madeline was aware that he would be a more acceptable match for her, and he could provide her with a better standard of living than Emile. William was well known in Glasgow to society, and in January 1857, Madeline and William were officially engaged. Madeline was, however, still secretly engaged to Emile. Madeline wrote to Emile to tell him that she would not visit him anymore, as her feelings towards him had changed. She did not inform him that she was now engaged to William. She also asked he return all the letters she had sent to him and deliver them to her housemaid. Madeline also wrote, but she shall return the letters he wrote to her the following day via the maid. Emile did not oblige to her request. Madeline was now getting a bit more desperate, so wrote to Emile again, and by now, Emile had heard rumors of her engagement to William Minnick, and he demanded to know if they were true. She said it was not, and asked again for the return of the letters. Emile again refused, saying that he was planning instead to show the letters to Madeline's father, begging him not to expose their past love, as it would bring great shame on her. In the second letter, she asked him to meet her again secretly. It was now February and March of 1857. The police and the courts would later pick over the events of the next several weeks in minute detail. At a supper with Miss Perry on February 17th, Emile said that he had plans to meet Madeleine the night of the 19th. It is not known whether the two did meet on the 19th, but later that night, Emile suffered violent stomach pains. Fortunately, he recovered by the following morning. On Saturday the 21st, Madeleine went to a local chemist and purchased a small amount of arsenic, which she said would be used to kill rats. As required by law, she signed the poison book at the time of purchase. At the time, arsenic was sold with coloring, such as soot or indigo mixed into it. This was to keep it from being confused with flour or sugar or other food substances. That night, Emile went out without letting his landlady or anyone else know where he was going. When he returned to his lodgings early in the morning of February 22nd, he was suffering with severe stomach pains, this time leaving him bedridden for 8 days. On March 6th, Madeleine again went to the chemist and bought more arsenic. On March 9th, Emile had tea with Miss Perry. And he said, as Perry would later testify, "I cannot think why I was so unwell after getting that coffee and chocolate from her." Perry understood the her to mean Madeleine. Emile then told Perry that he was so in love with Madeleine that if she were to poison me, I would forgive her. Perry asked what possible reason Madeleine would have for such an action. "I don't know that," Emile replied. "Perhaps she might not be sorry to be rid of me." On March the 17th, Madeleine and her family returned from a trip, and the following day, Madeleine made a third purchase of arsenic. Then on the 19th, Emile went on a weekend vacation to the Bridge of Allen, which is about 30 miles north of Glasgow. He returned unexpectedly the evening of March the 22nd, telling his landlady that he had received a letter calling him back, but he would return to Bridge of Allen the following day. He asked for the key to the front door as he expected to be out late, but did not specify his destination or plans for the evening. After midnight early in the morning of the 23rd, his landlady awoke to a commotion at the front door and found Emile outside and doubled up in pain. He died about 10 hours later. The letter that called him back was found in his pocket after his death and was from Madeleine. Within the next few days, more of Madeleine's letters were found in Emile's room and in his office. Madeleine, however, said nothing regarding the mysterious death, but was becoming the source of much local gossip. Thursday morning, March 26th, Madeleine's sister Janet awoke to find her eldest sister gone from the bed they shared, and gone from their room, and gone from the entire house. William Minnick stopped by the Smith home later that Thursday morning to pay a call on his intended bride, finding the family and servants in panic and hearing that Madeleine had gone missing. He suggested that she might have gone to the Smith summer house on the Clyde. The family agreed that this was possible, and William proposed that he and Madeleine's brother Jack traveled to the summer house, the rest of the family remaining at home in case she returned. William and Jack took the next train from Glasgow to Greenock, and there caught a steamer headed for Helensborough. Moving through the crowds of people on the boat, they found Madeleine sitting calmly and looking out at the water. She had boarded the boat earlier in Glasgow and showed no particular surprise at seeing the two of them. Sitting down next to her, William gently asked her why she fled and caused such worry to her family and friends. She began to respond. William told her to wait, as there were too many people about who might overhear. Once in the privacy of the large summer house, William asked again for the reason behind her disappearance. Madeleine told him she was afraid her parents would be very upset at what she had done and promised to tell him more later on. On March 31st, based on the stacks of letters found at Emile's lodgings and office, Madeleine was arrested. She gave a lengthy statement stating that she had last seen Emile 3 weeks previous to his death. She did not deny that they had been lovers, that she had written letters to him, or that they had secretly discussed marriage. Neither did she deny making 3 purchases of arsenic in the previous month. She had mixed the arsenic with water and washed her arms and face with it, a cosmetic use she had learned while at school. She had lied to the chemist about the arsenic's use. She said that she was too self-conscious to tell the chemist that it was for her complexion. She said she had never given Emile arsenic or anything else. The case became big news in Scotland, so the trial was moved from Glasgow to the Scottish capital, Edinburgh, and began on June 30th, 1857. Madeleine was represented by a team, including one of the greatest legal minds of the time, John Inglis. Due to the court's rules, Madeleine was not allowed to take the stand in her own defense, but had to rely solely on her legal counsel and on her deposition. During the trial, people swarmed the courthouse to catch a glimpse of Madeleine, and the crowds lined the streets every night as her carriage took her back to the East Jail of Edinburgh. The newspapers carried detailed descriptions of every aspect of the trial, and the proceedings became the chief topic of conversation throughout Scotland. The prosecution argued for the court to omit all of Madeline's letters and all of Emil's papers in evidence. Madeline's defense argued that her letters could be presented, but that a diary found in his room should not be admitted into evidence. The prosecution stated that the diary should be admitted as it contained notations that possibly indicated that Emil had seen Madeline right before the first and second attacks of his stomach illness. But with the author of the diary now dead, the defense argued that the written entries could not be questioned or properly cross-examined. The arguments were very persuasive on both sides, but decisively the defense won and the diary was withheld from the jury. The trial went on for 9 days and many witnesses, including Madeline's sister Janet, who testified, but she did not recall Madeline ever getting out of the bed the night of March 22nd, and William Minnick, who had quickly withdrawn his marriage proposal, took the stand. The prosecution called witnesses to testify about the contradictions in Madeline's story, but the defense countered with experts who discussed the cosmetic use of arsenic. And they called witnesses who claimed Emil had made statements to them regarding several prior suicide attempts. Madeline showed remarkable calmness and poise during the trial, refusing food and water while in court, but keeping a small jar of smelling salts, which she never had to use. She followed the questioning of witnesses closely and only showed discomfort when the text of some of her letters to Emil was read out. The prosecution argued that Madeline had already lied at least once about the real purpose of the arsenic and stated that Emil's refusal to return her letters and end the affair was motive enough for killing him. The defense pointed out that Emil had his first attack 2 days before Madeline's first recorded purchase of arsenic. The prosecution and the defense both put forward very strong cases, but due mainly to the fact that it could not be shown that Madeline and Emil had actually seen each other before any of his 3 attacks, the jury deliberated for only 30 minutes. And on July 9th, they reached a verdict of not proven. Not proven is a unique verdict in Scotland. That signifies that the accused was not found innocent, but the prosecution had not made a strong enough case to convict. Madeline went free that afternoon and returned to her family home. What actually happened on the night of March 23, 1857 will never be known. Many theories about the crime were prevalent in newspapers at the time and for many, many months afterwards. The newspaper The Scotsman wrote, "Madeline Smith is either the most fortunate of criminals or the most unfortunate of women." The neurotic of the trial followed Madeline, so she eventually decided to leave Scotland. Madeline went to London and in July 1861 married George Wardle, a draftsman and the business manager of the artist William Morris. She continued to remain silent about the trial and her accused crime. Although newspapers and curiosity seekers hounded her, after many years of marriage and 2 children, Madeline and George separated. After her divorce, what happened to Madeline is not known. Many say she went to France, others to Australia. The most widely accepted theory is that she went to New York City and changed her name to Lena Wardle Sheehy. Mrs. Sheehy died in 1928, but her death certificate states that she would have been 30 years younger than Madeline would have been on her death. So the mystery of whatever happened to Madeline Smith has never been proved. Wherever and whenever Madeline passed away, she took whatever she knew about Emil's death with her to her grave. Stella Christophi was born in the beautiful Mediterranean island of Cyprus in 1900. Her family were very poor and she did not receive much of an education. She was illiterate and at the age of 14 she married and later gave birth to a son, the couple called Stavros. Her relationship with her mother-in-law was bad and along with 2 other women in 1925, when she was 25 years old, she was put on trial in Cyprus for killing her own mother-in-law with the help of 2 other women. The way Christophi murdered her mother-in-law was quite brutal. She shoved a burning piece of wood down her throat. At the trial in Cyprus, however, the 3 women covered for each other and Christophi was acquitted for lack of evidence. Her husband, however, left her after the trial. So now she was homeless and very poor and left to bring up her son Stavros alone. She did, however, bring him up well, and Stavros grew up and got a job as a waiter in the country's capital, Nicosia. Stavros was a very good worker, and in 1941 he secured work in London, England as a waiter in Café de Paris, which was a very popular venue in the city. While working there, he met Helleglecher, who was a German, and worked in the sales department of a clothing store close to Café de Paris. They went out and eventually got married. The couple were happy and worked hard to improve their prospects, and after a while managed to move to the very nice area of Hampstead in London. They had 3 children and life was good, especially for Stavros, who had worked hard, learned English, and was liked by everyone who knew him. In July 1953, Stavros' mother decided to visit the family in London. She hadn't seen her son for 12 years. At first, the family welcomed Kristofi into their home. But as time went on, things started to deteriorate. There were rows between Hella and Kristofi. Kristofi blamed her daughter-in-law for everything. She didn't like the way Hella had decorated the house. She didn't like the way Hella brought up the children. And the fact that Stavros was happy living in London and did not want to go back to Cyprus really bothered Kristofi. Kristofi had been living in London with her son, daughter-in-law, and grandchildren for 12 months. And Hella had pretty much had enough of her mother-in-law. She had enough of the criticism. She told Stavros she was going to take the children to Germany for a visit, and when she came back, she expected her mother-in-law to have gone back to Cyprus. Kristof, however, liked living in London, and she had no intention of going back to her Mediterranean homeland. On Wednesday, July 28, 1954, Stavros left for work. He said goodbye to his wife, and then he said goodbye to his mother, who was in the living room. Hella had just put the children to bed, and she was about to have a shower. Kristofi heard the bathroom door close, so she went to the kitchen and took out the heavy metal tray from under the wooden stove. She crept upstairs and quietly opened the bathroom door. She saw Heller. Heller turned her head as the bathroom door opened. And with one hard blow, Kristofi hit her daughter-in-law in the head with the tray. Heller fell to the floor but was still alive. Kristofi then dragged the unconscious body to the kitchen, where she strangled her until she was dead, by using a scarf. According to the forensic report, she did this with so much force that the scarf had penetrated Hella's skin. Kristofi now had to cover her tracks, so she took off her son's wife's wedding ring and hid it in her bedroom. She then dragged the dead body out to the garden, where in an attempt to destroy the evidence, she put paraffin soaked round it and set it on fire. At the time, a neighbor, John Young, who was letting his dog out, noticed the fire in the back garden and could see what appeared to him to be a tailor's dummy being burnt. It was now 1 o'clock on Thursday morning. Kristof then ran into the street and raised the alarm by stopping a passing car. She shouted in her very limited English, "Fire burning, children sleeping." The fire brigade arrived and put out the fire. They rescued the children who were still asleep and discovered the partly charred body of a woman in the garden. They were able to notice a red mark around the neck. Kristofi had planned that the body would be too badly burnt to reveal anything. The police were then called and a search of the house revealed paper in Kristofi's room. When questioned, she told officers that she had been asleep and had been awakened by the sound of 2 male voices downstairs. She went downstairs and had seen one man in the garden before she went to Hella's bedroom, where there was no reply. She said she kept knocking on the door. She then saw the body on fire in the garden, so went for some water to try and put it out. Police did not buy her account of what happened, and immediately arrested her. She was remanded in custody, and after the post-mortem she was charged with murder. Kristof's son Stavros and her lawyers advised her to plead insanity, but she refused, saying, "I'm a poor woman of no education, but I'm not a mad woman." Dr. T. Christie, the principal medical officer at Holloway Prison, examined her and stated that after observation of the prisoner since the 30th of July, 1954, he had formed the conclusion that she was insane, but was medically fit to plead and stand trial. He found her to be suffering from a delusional disorder that made her fear that her grandchildren would not be brought up properly by Hella and that she would in time be excluded from seeing them due to the clash of cultures between the two women. This seems a reasonable conclusion, but did it make her insane? 1954 and lasted for several weeks. Despite the overwhelming evidence that included blood and paraffin on her own shoes, she kept protesting her innocence. The prosecution portrayed her as ungrateful, callous, and domineering. A woman who attacked an attractive young defenseless mother in the most gruesome manner, attacking a woman who had shown her nothing but hospitality and home. At the end of proceedings, the jury of 10 men and 2 women took just under 2 hours to find Kristof guilty. She was sentenced to death by hanging. Kristofi showed no emotion when the verdict was read out. However, under the provisions of Criminal Lunatics Act of 1884, the Home Secretary had the duty to have a condemned prisoner examined by prison psychiatrists to see if there was concern over their sanity. The psychiatrist reported that the prisoner was not in their view insane and that in their view she did not suffer from any minor mental abnormality which would justify them in making any recommendation for the reprieve of the sentence on medical grounds. On the 12th of December, it was announced that there would be no reprieve and the execution would be carried out on Wednesday the 15th of December. There was then a debate among British MPs on how that was possible. According to various accounts, 6 Labour members of Parliament questioned the death penalty in her case. One noted, the mere fact she did not claim insanity shows she is not of sound mind. Christoffel was the last foreign woman and the second to last female ever hanged in Britain. There was very little press interest in her execution. Some say this was because she was middle-aged, unattractive, and foreign. On the December 13, 1954, 29 years after she had murdered her mother-in-law in Cyprus, Christoffel was executed by hanging in Holloway Prison for murdering her daughter-in-law. Mary Bateman was born at Topcliffe in Yorkshire, England in 1768. Her father was a farmer and both her parents were well respected. From a very young age, Mary stole things wherever she went, even things she didn't really need. The stealing habit didn't stop. As an attempt to put Mary on a more law-abiding path, when she was 13, her parents sent her to work as a domestic servant in a large house. She started her work quite well, but soon started stealing from her employer and was dismissed. She was then dismissed from her next employer and her reputation started to spread, so no one wanted to employ her. Out of necessity, Mary moved to the city of Leeds. Here, she soon found work as a dressmaker and she was quite good at her role. Pay, however, was quite low, so resourceful Mary supplemented her income by becoming a soothsayer. Sooth is an Old English word which means truth, and a soothsayer is what we would probably refer to today as a fortune teller. When Mary was 24 years old, she met John Bateman, who was a wheelwright, and after a quick 3-week courtship they married. They had 4 children, including a son also christened John. Within 2 months of her marriage, Mary was again on the wrong side of the law for the many crimes she had committed. But she always was one step ahead of them and she always managed to escape arrest and prosecution by persuading her husband to move frequently from place to place. Her husband John, however, tired of his wife's constant tricks and schemes, so joined the supplementary militia. This meant that he worked away from his Leeds home for months on end and that Mary was reliant on herself to generate the income she needed to live on and bring up 4 children. By 1799, Mary was living in Marsh Lane, Leeds, and without any real trade she started to focus on her fortune-telling and claimed that she had supernatural powers. She made and sold potions that were supposed to cure various illnesses and ward off evil spirits. In the late 1700s and early 1800s, there was still a popular belief in the power of witchcraft, and quick-thinking Mary found she could cash in on it. It was a far more profitable and certainly less dangerous way of making money than stealing, as at the time, stealing was punished by hanging. It might seem incredible to us today that a relatively uneducated woman who was a career criminal could successfully convince a large number of people that she possessed supernatural powers and healing abilities. But Mary certainly succeeded in doing so. In 1803, Mary sold medicines to 2 sisters who lived above their draper's shop with their mother in St. Peter's Square. Mary sold the medicines which were in fact a mixture of poisons. When the 3 of them died, Mary calmly robbed their house and shot. When the neighbors asked why the women had died, she told them that they had caught bubonic plague. Amazingly, there was no inquest and no suspicion on Mary, so she just walked away from the crime and sold everything that she had stolen from the house. After this crime, Mary decided to go to the hospital. But it would be good to use an alias with all her scams. So she invented a character named Mrs. Moore. This non-existent lady was always consulted on behalf of Mary's clients. All clients were told, but the money she took from them was to go to Mrs. Moore. By 1806, clients thought it strange, but no one had ever seen Mrs. Moore. So Mary had to invent a new alias and named her Mrs. Blythe. By this time, she had moved to the Bramley area of Leeds where she met a wealthy childless middle-aged couple named William and Rebecca Herrigo. Rebecca was apparently suffering from dizziness whenever she laid down and was also having psychological problems, claiming to be haunted by a black dog and other spirits. She was told by her doctor that she was under a spell and that he was unable to help her. In about June 1806, the Herrigos were visited by their niece, who suggested that they employ help from Mary, who she said will be able to assist her aunt to get rid of the spirits that were possessing her. As a result, a meeting was arranged between the Herrigos and Mary outside the ironically named Black Dog Pub. Of course, Mary saw this as a very big money-making opportunity. Mary listened to Mrs. Herrigo's problems and explained that she was just a messenger for Mrs. Blythe. She told the unsuspecting couple that she would need an item of underclothing from Mrs. Herrigo, which she would send to Mrs. Blythe in Scarborough. who would be able to connect with Mrs. Perigo through the clothing to find a solution to stop the dizziness and end the black dog haunting. William Perigo took the petticoat to Mary, who promised to send it to Mrs. Blythe and told William to come and see her the following week. The following week, William arrived as promised and Mary showed him a letter from Mrs. Blythe. The imaginary Mrs. Blythe had instructed that Mary should go to the Perigo's house and sew 4 1-guinea notes and some gold coins which she had sent into each corner of Rebecca's bed where they were to be left for 18 months. A guinea is about £1.10. William was to give Mary 4 guinea notes in exchange to return to Mrs. Blythe. And remember, she had worked as a dressmaker, so was very good at sewing. The notes were sewn into the bed and William was instructed to visit Mary regularly to receive further instructions from Mrs. Blythe. The next instruction was that William should nail 2 horseshoes to the door. William was soon to receive a letter from Mrs. Blythe instructing him to take Mary further 2 guinea goats and to purchase cheese to be sent to her by Mary. The letter was to be burnt after he had read it. The next letter requested a small quantity of china and silverware to be sent to Mrs. Blythe, together with some tea and sugar. Again, the letter was to be burnt. The next request was for a bed and bedclothes, as Mrs. Blythe was unable to sleep in her own bed due to the problems she was having with the spirits that had taken over Mrs. Perigo. The letter was to be immediately burnt after all this had been actioned. The letters continued. The following one predicted an illness in the Perigo's house affecting one or both of them. It instructed Mrs. Perigo to take half a pound of honey to Mary, who would mix it with some special medicine that Mrs. Blythe had made. The letter also stated that the Perigos were to eat puddings for 6 days, and they were to mix into each of the puddings a packet of powder that Mary would give them. The Perigos began eating the puddings. Interestingly, the letter said, but only 1 pudding was to be made each day. Nobody else was to be allowed to eat any of it, and that if there was any left over, it must be immediately destroyed. It also said, but should William or Rebecca become ill, they were not to go to the doctor because he would be unable to help. Unsurprisingly, this letter, like its predecessors, was to be burnt. So Mary's plan was that the Perigos would poison themselves and destroy all the evidence of Mary's involvement. You may wonder how an adult couple could be so naive in the early 1800s, but Mr. Perigo just wanted his wife to be cured. And his doctor had already informed him that his wife was possessed and was unable to cure her. The couple began eating the puddings with no ill effects, but on the 6th day they tasted a little different, and it caused William and Rebecca Perigo to have severe stomach cramps and vomiting. As directed, a doctor was not consulted, and Rebecca died a horrible death on the 24th of May, 1807. Her husband William, however, did consult a doctor who suspected that Rebecca could have been poisoned, but no postmortem was carried out. William Perigo stopped eating the puddings and started to recover. Mary had been very clever up to this time. Through Mrs. Blythe, she continued to demand items of value from the Perigos, but no more than she assessed that they could afford. In view of William's successful business, William Perigo decided to examine the little silk purses that contained the guinea notes and gold coins that Mrs. Blythe had asked to have sewn into Rebecca's bed. Would they still contain the notes and coins that had been placed in them? He looked, but instead they contained cabbage leaves and copper coins. William finally started to realize that he had been deceived by Mary. William then arranged a meeting with Mary, saying he wanted to purchase another bottle of medicine, but he also went to see the local constable. At the meeting, Mary bought a little bottle of liquid containing oatmeal and arsenic. Mary had a problem, as William had lived rather than died, as she had planned, but with the oatmeal and arsenic she would now be able to finish him off. The constable, however, very quickly saw what Mary was doing and took Mary into custody, and followed this by searching her house, where he found many of the items that the Perigos had given to Mary to be sent to the imaginary Mrs. Blythe. The constable was not a naive man, and Mary appeared before the magistrates the following day, charged with Rebecca's murder. They committed her for trial, and on Friday, March 17, 1809, at York Castle, she came before the judge, Sir Simon Leblanc. Evidence of the handwriting was submitted, which showed Mrs. Blythe's letters were identical to Mary's. Forensic evidence was provided, which analyzed the remains of the honey and found that it mercuric chloride, which was extremely poisonous and was consistent with the symptoms displayed by the Perigos. Mary's defense was very simple. She just denied any involvement with Mrs. Perigo's death. Sir Simon Leblanc summoned up and told the jury that to bring in a guilty verdict, they had to satisfy themselves on 3 points. These were that Rebecca Perigo had died from poisoning, that the poison had been administered with the knowledge of Mary and that it had been done with the aim of causing Rebecca Perigo's death. He went on to remind the jury that although there was a strong case against Mary for having systematically defrauded the Perigos, this did not make her automatically guilty of murder. The evidence of criminality and murder was so overwhelming that it did not take the jury long to deliver its verdict of guilty. In accordance with the usual procedure, Mary was asked if she had anything to say as to why sentence of death should not be pronounced on her. With teary eyes, she told the judge that she was pregnant. As a result, the judge ordered the court doors to be locked and got a doctor to examine her. Mary was found not to be pregnant, and the judge proceeded to sentence her to be hanged and afterwards dissected on the following Monday. Mary was aged 41 at the time and had an infant child with her in prison up till the time she was condemned. Over the weekend, Mary wrote a letter to her husband in which she enclosed her wedding ring and asked him to give it to their daughter. She admitted some of her crimes but continued to deny the murders. It was reported in a Leeds newspaper that she continued her criminal habits even in the condemned cell, telling the fortune of other inmates for a guinea. Mary was executed on Monday the 20th of March, 1809 in front of a very large crowd who had gathered to see her. Many still believed she had supernatural powers and there was some sympathy for her. Many also believed that she would be saved from death by some divine intervention, but this was not to be. Mary continued to deny any involvement in the murder and her other criminal activities to the end. After execution, Mary's body was sent to the Leeds Royal Infirmary for dissection and afterwards put on display. The public paid 3 pence each to view her body and £30 was raised for the hospital. Her skeleton, together with her body, was taken to the hospital, with a plaster cast of her death mask, were put on display and can be seen today at the Thackeray Museum in Leeds. Sunny Ong was from a middle-class family. He was well-educated and well-spoken. He was attending teacher training college when he suddenly left in 1957 to join a government scholarship scheme to become a commercial pilot. The idea of becoming a pilot was far more glamorous and fast-paced in Ang's world. This didn't last and he was asked to leave the course because he ignored safety regulations. So he had left teacher training and failed to become a pilot. He then took part in the 1961 Singapore Grand Prix. Now, this was a tourism event, not the Formula One event it is today, but Ong was a skilled driver. The race was attended by rich, high-standing, and influential people, the type of people that Ong aspired to mix with. In 1962, he was arrested for negligent driving after killing a pedestrian. This was followed by being put on probation for attempted burglary. The same year, he started studying for a law degree, but shortly after starting, he was made bankrupt. Life for the young Ong, who wanted to be a wealthy, prosperous young man in the early 60s, wasn't going exactly as he had hoped. Jenny Chung Kid was a waitress at Odeon Bar and Restaurant. She was very different to Ong as she only had a basic education. For her work, she didn't earn very much money. Her main income was from the daily tips from customers. She lived with her 2 children and her husband, but the marriage was not a good one. Her main aspiration was to have a happy and fulfilling life. Jenny and Ong met in 1963. He was 24, she was 22. He was handsome and educated. She was naive and simple. She fell completely in love with Ong, who made out to be sophisticated and well-off. She left her husband and her unhappy married life. Soon after they met, Jenny left her job, and Ong borrowed a friend's car and drove his new girlfriend to Kuala Lumpur for a holiday. Jenny was really excited about the trip, but it was unfortunately cut short as the couple both became ill. However, before they returned to Singapore, Ong took out an insurance accident policy on himself and Jenny. $30,000 for himself and $100,000 for her. Remarkably, some may say, after taking out the policies, their car crashed on the way back from Kuala Lumpur, allegedly as a dog had run out onto the road. The passenger side of the car was damaged, but Jenny escaped the crash with minor injuries. The couple continued to date, and Jenny became increasingly infatuated with Ong. Ong decided to take out more accident insurance on Jenny, totaling $400,000. The beneficiaries were Ang's mother, who Jenny had only briefly met, or Jenny's estate, at the start of August 1963, and took Jenny to make a will, leaving her entire estate to his mother. Besotted and naive, Jenny just signed the paperwork, believing and to be a kind-hearted, perfect boyfriend. On Monday, August 26th, one of Jenny's policies expired. So Ong extended the policy for just 5 days. The policy gave twice for some if he insured died from natural causes, but 4 times, or $160,000 if death was a result of an accident. The reason Ong gave as to why these policies were all short-term was because his girlfriend wanted to take up flying as she was the heiress of a chicken farm. This of course was not true, and Jenny had no income to pay the insurance premiums, but her boyfriend was paying them for her. It is estimated that the total sum insured was about $900,000. At 2:30 p.m. on Tuesday, August 27, 1963, Ong and Jenny chartered a boat with a boatman at Jardine Steps. They said they wanted to go diving and paid the boatman for the trip. They went out into Singapore Straits until Ong instructed the boatman to drop anchor near Sisters Island. Ong, who was in swimming trunks, had also brought along 3 air tanks, 2 pairs of small aqualung equipment, and a transistor radio. Ong dropped a guide rope and he helped Jenny put on a dive belt to which the axe, a knife, and a metal weight were attached. Jenny was a bit anxious as she had never dived before but entered the water alone. Some 10 minutes later she surfaced. Ong changed her tank and she went back into the water. Still in his trunks, Ong started checking his own tank and found that it was leaking. He said the problem was with the washer and the boatman helped him improvise a new one, but it still would not work and Jenny was still somewhere underwater. Ong then tugged at the guide rope 3 times and asked, "Where's the girl?" The boatman said he did not know. Ong gave 3 more tugs. There were still no sign of his girlfriend. Ong pulled the rope up and told the boatman to look for air bubbles in the water. There were none. "What are we going to do?" Ong asked. The boatman suggested going to a nearby St. John's Island to call the police. He hauled anchor, circled a few times to look for bubbles, and then left for the island. Very strangely, neither the boatman or Ong entered the water to look for Jenny. They went to the island, but the boat was slow. Despite his girlfriend going missing, Ong was quite calm, never shouting at the boatman to speed up, and when they did arrive, he did not rush onto the island as a desperate boyfriend probably would have. Ong returned with a guard who suggested picking up some fishermen from a nearby island on his way back to where Jenny had gone missing. They returned with 5 fishermen, all of whom dived into the water to look for Jenny while Ong stayed in the boat. All that was recovered from Jenny was a single flipper worn by her. It had been severed cleanly at the top and bottom, likely by a sharp instrument such as a knife or razor blade. Diving experts said that the loss of a flipper would have affected the person's mobility. Jenny, being an unexperienced diver, would have panicked and probably drowned in the strong currents around the island. The police always suspected Ann, a skilled diver, who didn't enter the water. He also stood to gain from the insurance policies he had purchased for Jenny shortly after they met. The police reclassified Jenny's disappearance as murder on the September 5, 1963. Their investigations finally led them to arrest Ong on the December 21, 1964, and he was charged with murder the next day. When Ang's case was mentioned in court on the December 29th, the magistrate rejected the prosecution's request for an adjournment to build their case and granted Ong a discharge, but a discharge that did not amount to an acquittal. However, Ong was rearrested an hour later and again charged with the crime. This time on the December 30th, the prosecution pressed for an extra adjournment, citing the seriousness of the alleged offense and the extra time they needed to prepare the case due to the circumstances. This time the magistrate accepted the prosecution application and disallowed bail. Following the preliminary inquiry, which lasted from the 25th of February to the 5th of March 1965, Ong was tried in the High Court before a 7-man jury between the 26th of April and the 18th of May. The case was very unusual as it was the first case in Singapore and Malaysia where there was no body. All the evidence presented was circumstantial. Expert witnesses testified that the waters around Sisters Island were dangerous due to strong undercurrents and that it was unsafe for a novice to dive alone in those waters. But Jenny had personal accident policies for over $450,000, a substantial amount in the 1960s. The policies were taken out within 3 weeks of Ong first meeting Jenny. The beneficiaries named in these policies were either Ang's mother or Jenny's estate. One of the insurance policies for the sum of $150,000 had lapsed on the 26th of August, had been extended on the morning of the August 27, 1963 for a further 5 days. Evidence was also produced that Ang did not renew or extend his own accident policy, which had been taken out at the same time. Another of Jenny's accident policies for the sum of $100,000 was due to expire on the August 28th, one day after she disappeared. It also transpired that Jenny had drawn up a will on August 7, 1963 at Brattles Brothers law firm, and that she had been accompanied by Ong, and that Ang's mother was named as a sole beneficiary. The representatives from insurance companies also testified that Ong had filed for claims with their companies on Jenny's insurance policies barely 24 hours after the disappearance of his girlfriend. Ang's actions on the day were highlighted. The fact he never entered the water to look for Jenny and did not seem anxious when she failed to resurface or display any urgency in getting help from nearby St. John's Island. But there was no body and Ong did not enter the water, so how could he have murdered his girlfriend if he hadn't entered the water? The trial concluded after 13 days. The jury deliberated for only 2 hours and on the 18th of May, 1965, unanimously delivered the verdict of guilty to the murder of Jenny. Ong appealed the verdict, but all appeals were rejected. He petitioned for clemency to the President of Singapore, but this was also rejected on the 31st of January, 1967. Ong was hanged on Monday, February 6, 1967. Jenny's body was never found. John Billington was born in the English county of Lincolnshire around 1580. At the time of his birth, Queen Elizabeth I was on the English throne. This was a time when most of the population lived in small villages and made their living from farming. However, towns and cities were starting to grow larger and more important. Trade and industry was growing rapidly, and England was becoming a more commercial country. The mining of coal, tin, and lead flourished. So did the iron industry. And as they flourished, England became richer and richer. This period is often referred to as the Golden Age. As England grew more prosperous, life for the well-off became more comfortable. Upper-class and middle-class people benefited from the growing wealth of the country, and they started looking overseas for further ways to increase their wealth. However, for the poor in Elizabethan England, life did not improve. For them, life was hard and tough. Like many poor people at the time who lived in the countryside, John Billington came to work in London, and they had 2 sons named John Jr. and Francis. The Elizabethan period came to an end on the 24th of March, 1603, upon the death of the Queen, and James I became King of England, starting the Jacobean era. The Jacobean era was far from golden, and many people lived in terrible conditions. The era ended with a severe economic depression. John Billington found it hard to provide for his family and lived in debt and on the brink of poverty. In order to try and improve his circumstances, he made a deal with a prominent London businessman which enabled him and his family to travel to America on board the ship, the Mayflower. It was agreed that he would sail to Virginia, and on the ship's arrival in Virginia, he and his family would work on behalf of the colony. Until 1627. A 7-year contract tying him to the colony was a big commitment, but John calculated that life in the New World must be better than his impoverished existence in London. On September 16, 1620, the Mayflower left Plymouth, England, bound for America with 102 passengers on board, including the Billington family. The ship was heading for Virginia. John Billington, who was loyal to the Church of England, soon realized that he was vastly different from many of his fellow passengers. 35 of them were members of the radical English separatist church who were traveling to America to escape the jurisdiction of the Church of England, which they found corrupt. 10 years earlier, English religious persecution had led a group of separatists to go and live in self-exile in Holland in search of religious freedom. However, many were dissatisfied with their economic opportunities in Holland and, under the direction of their leader, William Bradford, decided to emigrate. Virginia, where an English colony had been founded in Jamestown in 1607. The separatists had financial backing from a group of investors called the London Adventurers, who had promised a sizable share of the colony's profits. As the Mayflower had been delayed, leaving England by 1 month, the journey to America was very difficult and the ship encountered rough seas and storms. The conditions resulted in the Mayflower being blown off course by more than 500 miles. On November the 21st, 1620, after a 66-day voyage, the ship landed on the tip of Cape Cod at what is now Provincetown, Massachusetts. As the supplies were running low and the storms and high winds continued, it was decided to draft a document to serve as a basis for self-government known as the Mayflower Compact and settle in Cape Cod instead of trying to continue their journey to Jamestown. During the journey across the Atlantic, John Billington had made multiple enemies and had already established a reputation as a troublemaker. His son Francis also left an indelible impression on his fellow passengers, firing his father's gun near a powder keg in the ship's crowded cabin on December 5, 1620. A rash act that resulted in a fire on board and could have sunk the ship before most of the passengers had even set foot on American soil. Upon establishing camp, the settlers went on to face the harsh realities of a New England winter. Nearly half of them died during this time, which left the population to about 50. The Billington family all survived the winter, and when spring came, the two boys were soon off exploring their new home. Francis, hoping to discover a new ocean, found a small lake behind the town that was given the name Billington Sea, which I believe it is still called today. John Jr. became lost in the woods and turned up on Cape Cod after a search party was sent out to find him. In March 1621, John Billington was brought before the company and charged with contempt of the captain's lawful command with abusive speeches when called to perform military duty. But he escaped punishment as this was his first offense, and he expressed some humility during his hearing. In April 1621, Governor Carver collapsed while working in the fields on a hot day. He died a few days later. The settlers of Plymouth then chose William Bradford as the new governor. This was not good for John Billington, as the new governor didn't like his attitude, unlawful behavior, or his religion. In 1622, there was an unexplained destroyed 4 houses. Many considered John to be responsible, but this was only due to his reputation, as there was no evidence to suggest that he was the culprit. John was in trouble again in 1624 when John Oldham and John Lifford were banished from Plymouth for writing letters critical of the colony. When questioned before the governing council, Limford implicated others, including John Billington. No proof was actually found against him, and when questioned, John said he had no knowledge of the plot and was never officially charged. Shortly after, John's wife, Eleanor, was found guilty of slander and sentenced to a whipping. After the issue of the exile of John Oldham and John Lifford died down, John Billington's anti-government agitation continued. In 1626, the people of the colony received full ownership of the plantation, so they divided the land among themselves. John Billington did not receive a particularly good deal, receiving a modest house, 63 acres of land, and future land rights. His lack of social status, loyalty to the Church of England, and repeated run-ins with authorities seemed to have made him a permanent outsider. In 1630, John Billington was caught in an argument with his neighbor, John Newcomen. Records are unclear as to just why or how this argument started. A few days later, Newcomen was seen leaving the town, and shortly afterwards, John Billington was observed heading in the same direction. Later that day, Newcomen was found dead. He had been shot. John Billington was accused of the crime. He apparently had a motive, and according to the governor, William Bradford, the weapon used could be traced to him. John was tried by a jury who found him guilty of willful murder, and the governor, William Bradford, concluded that Billington should be sentenced to death by hanging. Governor Bradford was probably not reluctant to hang John Billington, given his past activity as a leading dissident in Plymouth. There was a substantial legal question as to whether the local authorities governing the Plymouth colony possessed criminal jurisdiction sufficient to impose capital punishment. William Bradford was able to persuade John Winthrop, the newly appointed governor of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, to concur in the death sentence, that the conviction was based solely on circumstantial evidence. John Billington may have quarreled with Newcomen, but researchers for the Society of Mayflower Descendants have questioned the accuracy of Bradford's commentary on the trial, observing that the governor obviously disliked and criticized the entire family from the beginning. John Billington was hanged not far from Plymouth Rock and buried in an unknown location. He was the first recorded murderer in what would become the United States of America.